It's all right, son. I'm here to help. Can you tell me your name?
It happened in a place most people passed without looking twice, a stretch of pavement near closed storefronts where cardboard, old blankets, and forgotten belongings blended into the background of the city. The child had been there for days, maybe longer, small enough to be overlooked, old enough to know not to ask for much. He kept his distance from people, watching shoes instead of faces, learning which footsteps meant indifference and which meant trouble. When the officer noticed him, it wasn't because of a complaint or a call for service. It was because something felt out of place, a stillness that didn't belong to the noise around it. The child sat quietly, trying to make himself invisible, holding onto a bag that carried everything he owned. There was no sign asking for help, no attempt to draw sympathy, just a quiet endurance shaped by necessity. The officer approached slowly, not with questions or commands, but with awareness, understanding that sudden attention could feel like a threat. He spoke in a measured tone, introducing himself without authority, giving the child space to decide whether to respond. The child hesitated, offering short answers, clearly accustomed to interactions that ended quickly or turned uncomfortable. As they talked, it became clear that the child had no stable place to go, no adult consistently responsible for him, and no expectation that kindness would last beyond the moment. The officer listened without interruption, without expressing shock or judgment, even though the situation was far from ordinary. What stood out was not the lack of resources, but the lack of expectation. The child did not ask for help. He did not ask for food. He did not ask for anything at all. That silence carried more weight than words. Instead of moving on or calling it in as someone else's responsibility, the officer stayed. He sat nearby, matching the child's level, allowing the space between them to feel less intimidating. He offered simple things without ceremony: food, conversation, time, treating the child as someone worth engaging with rather than a problem to be managed. People began to notice. Not because the officer was performing an act of heroism, but because kindness in that setting was unexpected. Passers-by slowed down. Some watched. Some questioned. The officer remained unaffected by the attention, focused only on the child in front of him. For the first time in a long while, the child experienced something unfamiliar, not charity, not pity, but dignity. Someone had chosen to see him, to stay present, and to act without needing recognition. That quiet decision, made in full view of a city accustomed to looking away, would soon ripple outward, challenging assumptions and altering perspectives in ways no one could have predicted. As time went on, the officer's quiet interaction with the child began to draw more attention than either of them had intended. What started as a simple conversation slowly became a point of focus for people passing by, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it stood in contrast to what was usually seen in that space. Some pedestrians slowed their steps, unsure why they felt compelled to look again. Others stopped entirely, watching from a distance, trying to understand what they were seeing. A police officer was not issuing instructions, not moving someone along, not enforcing rules. He was listening. He was offering time, something that could not be dismissed as routine. A few people questioned his actions quietly, wondering why resources were being spent on someone who, in their view, had already been written off. Others felt an unfamiliar discomfort, realizing how easily they themselves had ignored the same child only moments earlier. The officer remained focused, unaffected by the shifting attention around him. He spoke to the child as an equal participant in the moment, explaining things clearly, answering questions honestly, and never rushing the exchange. The child, sensing that this interaction was not conditional, began to respond differently. His posture relaxed slightly. His answers became longer, less guarded. He spoke about how he moved from place to place, how he learned when to stay quiet, how he avoided asking for help because it often led to disappointment or judgment. The officer absorbed this information without reaction, understanding that the most important thing he could offer right now was not a solution, but validation. As the minutes passed, the officer made practical decisions quietly, contacting appropriate services without framing the situation as an emergency or a failure. He explained each step to the child, not to reassure him, but to include him. This transparency mattered. It showed respect. Around them, conversations began to shift. People who had been watching started talking among themselves, questioning their own assumptions, reconsidering what responsibility looked like in shared spaces. Some approached cautiously, offering small gestures, food, a blanket, words of concern. The officer did not encourage or discourage this attention. He simply ensured that it did not overwhelm the child. Throughout it all, the officer maintained the same calm presence, demonstrating that kindness did not require performance. The child noticed this consistency and responded to it, no longer shrinking inward or preparing for the interaction to end abruptly. For the first time in a long while, he was not bracing himself for dismissal. The situation did not resolve quickly, and there was no clear ending yet, but something had already changed. A moment that could have passed unnoticed had instead become a quiet disruption, forcing those who witnessed it to confront how easily they had learned to look away. And at the center of it all, the child remained seated beside the officer, no longer invisible, experiencing the unfamiliar weight of being acknowledged without condition. As the situation continued to unfold, the effects of that moment began to extend beyond the immediate interaction between the officer and the child. What had started as a quiet act of kindness gradually took on a broader significance, not because it was shared online or announced publicly, but because it challenged an unspoken pattern that many people had accepted without question. The officer's actions reframed the space itself, transforming a familiar street corner from a place of avoidance into one of attention. The child, now aware that this interaction was not temporary or performative, began to engage more openly, asking questions he had learned not to ask and expressing concerns he had previously kept to himself. He spoke about fear, not of danger, but of being forgotten again, of being passed from one temporary solution to another without stability. The officer listened carefully, responding with clarity rather than reassurance, making no promises he could not keep. He explained what support options existed, what steps could realistically be taken, and what might take time. This honesty, delivered without dismissal, allowed the child to participate in decisions rather than being subjected to them. Around them, the atmosphere continued to shift. People who had initially watched from a distance began to understand that the officer's presence was not about authority, but about accountability. Some reflected quietly on their own habits of looking away. Others recognized how easily compassion had been replaced by assumption. The officer did not address the crowd or acknowledge the attention. His focus remained fixed on the child, ensuring that whatever followed would not feel like another disruption imposed without explanation. As arrangements were gradually put into motion, the child did not resist or withdraw. He remained present, engaged, and aware, a response shaped by the fact that he had been treated as someone whose understanding mattered. Even as the practical aspects of assistance began to take form, the most significant change had already occurred internally. The child no longer viewed himself as someone existing outside of concern. He had been acknowledged without condition, treated with patience, and included in his own narrative. The officer, aware that his role would not extend indefinitely, concentrated on reinforcing that sense of dignity rather than dependency. He ensured the transition forward was steady, deliberate, and transparent. There was no dramatic resolution, no visible moment of transformation, yet the impact was undeniable. A situation that could have ended in silence instead became a turning point defined by attention and restraint. Long after the officer moved on and the street returned to its usual rhythm, the effect of that choice remained, carried forward by a child who had learned, perhaps for the first time, that kindness could exist without spectacle and that being seen did not always require asking. As time passed and the immediate attention faded, the deeper consequences of that moment became clearer in quieter ways. The child moved forward into a different phase of life, supported by systems and people that had previously felt distant or unreliable, yet the memory of that interaction remained steady. It was not remembered as a dramatic rescue or a moment of publicity, but as a reference point, a time when someone chose to act with care rather than convenience. The officer returned to his regular duties, blending back into routines that rarely pause long enough to acknowledge their impact. He did not speak about what he had done, nor did he frame it as something extraordinary. To him, it was simply the result of choosing to respond when ignoring would have been easier. Still, that choice altered how he approached similar situations afterward, reinforcing the understanding that enforcement and empathy were not mutually exclusive. For the child, the experience reshaped expectations. He no longer measured interactions solely by how quickly they ended or how little they demanded. He began to recognize patience, consistency, and clarity as signals of genuine concern. This shift influenced how he engaged with others, how he asked questions, and how he accepted help without suspicion. There were challenges ahead, and the path was not free of uncertainty, but the foundation had changed. He had learned that dignity could be offered without condition, and that kindness did not have to be earned through invisibility. The city itself returned to its usual rhythm, and most who had witnessed the moment moved on without revisiting it. Yet its effect persisted beyond visibility. A single act of calm attention had interrupted a cycle of neglect, not through force or authority, but through presence. In the absence of spectacle, what remained was continuity. The officer's role had ended in form, but the influence of that choice continued, carried forward in the child's sense of self and in the subtle recalibration of what responsibility could look like when applied with intention rather than obligation. As the years moved forward, the memory of that day did not remain fixed as a single event, but slowly became part of a broader understanding of how lives are shaped by moments that rarely receive attention. The officer continued his work, responding to calls, enforcing rules, and moving through environments where urgency often replaced reflection. Yet that experience stayed with him, quietly influencing how he interpreted responsibility. He became more aware of the difference between presence and procedure, between resolving an issue and acknowledging a person. He understood that authority carried weight not because of power, but because of how it was exercised in moments when no one was watching. He did not seek validation for what he had done, nor did he measure its value by outcome alone. Instead, it reinforced a personal standard, one that guided his decisions long after the situation itself had ended. For the child, the impact unfolded gradually, woven into daily choices and expectations rather than preserved as a dramatic memory. He moved through new environments with a cautious but growing sense of confidence, no longer assuming that neglect was the default response. The experience had shifted his internal framework, teaching him that kindness could exist without conditions and that attention did not always come with hidden cost. He learned to recognize sincerity, to distinguish between indifference and care, and to accept help without feeling diminished. This understanding influenced how he engaged with others, how he navigated uncertainty, and how he envisioned his place in the world. The absence of constant support no longer felt destabilizing, because the foundation of dignity had been established. There was no defining reunion, no moment of acknowledgement that closed the story neatly. Instead, the significance of that interaction revealed itself through continuity. The officer and the child continued their lives independently, shaped by many influences beyond that day, yet subtly connected by the same understanding. The child did not owe his future to a single act, and the officer did not claim ownership over the outcome. That lack of expectation allowed the impact to remain intact. In the end, what endured was not the visibility of kindness, but its restraint. A choice made quietly, without spectacle, had interrupted a pattern of invisibility and replaced it with recognition. The city continued to move, routines resumed, and most people never knew what had happened. But somewhere within that flow, a child carried forward the knowledge that he had been seen without being asked to perform for it, and an officer carried forward the reminder that sometimes the most meaningful form of duty is simply refusing to look away.